David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, big news. After weeks, really 2 months of this back and forth, former Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller is going to testify before Congress. And as far as we know right now, it's going to be public and it's going to be televised and it's going to be huge. Right now, the date is July 17th. Robert Mueller is going to testify before two House panels, the Judiciary and the Intelligence Committee panels. This is according to the respective chairpeople of those two committees. And I hope that enough time is actually allocated for this, that Robert Mueller can be questioned in depth. And to refresh your memory, in his nearly 450-page report, Robert Mueller said he could not exonerate Donald Trump from obstruction of justice. If he could have exonerated Trump on the basis of his investigation, he would have said it in clear and certain terms, which he did not. And in fact, Robert Mueller's report, once you got past the propagandizing of it, including through the Barr letter, which we'll talk about, the report actually said there was significant evidence of obstruction, meeting all three legal requirements of obstruction in 8 of the 14 different possible obstructive acts into which Robert Mueller looked. Now, what we don't yet know is whether Robert Mueller ultimately agreed to this public testimony under threat of subpoena, because we had every indication that Robert Mueller did not want to testify and that he had been resisting testifying. He wanted his statement from a few weeks ago to be all that was said in addition to the report itself. Robert Mueller actually saying the report is my testimony. And clearly that was not good enough for Democrats in the House and Senate, and rightly so. Then it became clear that Robert Mueller would accept testifying if it were private, behind closed doors, and not televised. And Democrats again said it should be public and it should be televised, rightly so. And now it will be time to see, what does Donald Trump do to try to obstruct or distract from or get in the way of these hearings, and of course to distract from the content of the hearings as well. And there are a few different lines that are being pushed on this from the Trumpists so far. As of right now, as of when we're taping the show today, and this may have changed by the time you listen to or watch this segment, Donald Trump has not activated around this news in any way. But from what I've been seeing from Trumpists in the normal right-wing Trumpist enclaves of the internet, there's a few different talking points that are being repeated ad nauseum. Number one is simply nothing is going to come of this period and nothing notable is going to be said by Robert Mueller. Repeating that Robert Mueller already said his full investigation is in the report. There's nothing else to be said by Robert Mueller. The talking point that Robert Mueller testifying is going to help Donald Trump win re-election in 2020, and that Democrats are stupid for doing this. The word nothing burger is being repeated frequently. And like with everything else, we just have to wait and see. I mean, that's it. If we've learned anything from the last however long we've been following politics and corporate media reporting on politics, it's that we need to wait and see what actually happens. They said all along, the Trumpists did, that the Mueller report would have nothing in it. Although you had some strategic people like Rudy Giuliani saying, oh, we expect it could be bad in order to sort of pad the landing, so to speak. But the hardcore Trumpists who were not working directly for Trump were saying the Mueller report is going to have nothing. And in the end, the Mueller report ended up saying he can't exonerate Trump. There's substantial evidence of 8 counts of criminal obstruction. Huge. And Mueller testifying publicly on live television is also going to be huge. If you thought that Michael Cohen's testimony was a big event for the world of C-SPAN and the like, Robert Mueller's testimony is going to be orders of magnitude bigger than that. And we do not know what is going to be said. What we do know is that before the Mueller report came out, the Trump campaign, the Trump administration, the Trump inner circle ran this massive disinformation campaign, which included at its sort of center, as its centerpiece, the Barr letter itself, which was a complete and total misrepresentation of the content of the Mueller report. They're going to do it again, okay? No matter what Trumpists will say, Mueller is not a credible person, and they will attack Mueller personally. They will say after the testimony, Mueller either brought nothing serious to the table, or if he claimed to bring something serious to the table, Mueller was lying. And that's why the character assassination in advance will be key to this strategy, laying the groundwork. And we know this in advance, so we have to remember not to be influenced in any way by what these Trumpist actors say. They will attack Mueller's credibility no matter what. They will go after the process of the investigation no matter what. They will continue to demand counter investigations, either into the investigators or into Hillary Clinton, or some into Barack Obama they want investigated. So we should be setting realistic expectations, and I'll talk about that in a second, but we should not be paying even one iota of attention to the predictable talking points that we're going to see from the Trumpist right. So as far as the expectations go, it's not likely that Robert Mueller is going to reveal anything substantively shocking related to the results of the report that's not in the report. But that doesn't matter, because the entire point here is most Americans have not read the report. When I have advocated for an immediate start to an impeachment inquiry in the House of Representatives, it's not because I believe it will get Trump removed from the White House, from the Oval Office, more at all, or certainly not more quickly than just voting him out in November of 2020. The issue is that many Americans' perception of the report is what's in the Barr letter, the no collusion, no obstruction talking point circulated by Donald Trump's national exoneration tour, on which he went after the Barr letter was published. And by having a one day, hopefully multiple days of hearings with Robert Mueller, will confirm and restate what's in the report, which will be news to most Americans. That in itself will be a huge win, because it will inform people of the content of the report, something most Americans do not know about. Some because of deliberate ignorance, some because they're just busy living their lives. And so this is why, in the same way that an impeachment inquiry would be extraordinarily useful merely by publicizing the content of the Mueller report, Mueller testifying will hopefully do the exact same thing. So that's the news as we know it as of right now. By tonight, this may even be different, but we will have more coverage of this as we get closer to July 17th. Good news overall. Okay, it starts tonight, the first Democratic presidential debate. Now, as a reminder, there are so many candidates still in this thing on the Democratic side that the first debate is being split into two parts, Part A and Part B. Part A is tonight, Part B is tomorrow, Thursday evening. This debate is on NBC. Here are the lineups once again as a reminder, the goal to sort of split up the frontrunners. It ended up with Elizabeth Warren as the only frontrunner on night A, and all of the other frontrunners on night B. Tonight, the first night, it will be Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Tulsi Gabbard, Julian Castro, Tim Ryan, Jay Inslee, Bill de Blasio, and John Delaney. Night 2, tomorrow night, we'll see Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, as well as Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris. Andrew Yang is on night 2. Kirsten Gillibrand, Hickenlooper, Williamson, Bennett, and Swalwell, all on night 2. So tonight, Elizabeth Warren is the lone front runner. This could help her, this could hurt her. We don't know. We're just going to have to wait and see. On the one hand, there might be more interest tonight than tomorrow because it is officially the first debate night of the 2020 Democratic primary. On the other hand, if you combine the polling support of the night B candidates and assume, maybe incorrectly, that the viewership will correspond to the aggregate polling support of the candidates on each night, then we would expect that tomorrow night with Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders will be the evening that gets larger viewership, more of an audience. In any case, what has continued to be the prevailing and growing narrative in the lead up to this first debate is Joe Biden's steady decline in the polls, combined with a surge by Bernie Sanders and then Elizabeth Warren, and most recently, both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. If you look at the image we have on the screen for our video audience, you will notice that Joe Biden's lead is now the smallest it has been since he formally announced that he's running. And meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren has had her slow and steady surge. Bernie Sanders just popped up several points in the most recent polls from Emerson University and Politico. So I am excited for the debates to start, mostly to start, number one, separating the wheat from the chaff and really seeing who's going to have even remote staying power here. And I'll be honest, I look forward to the number of candidates being reduced. I think it is great that so many people have said, I'm going to run, and have put forward varying political platforms, some more detailed, some less detailed, some more focused on economic policy, some more on social policy. We have seen candidates who are more focused domestically and others who want to talk more about foreign policy. But in the end, this is a list of candidates in total that should be culled. I'm ready for that to happen. And I'm interested to see if any of the sort of smaller candidates that are certainly have strong support from the people that like them are going to pop in the polls as their supporters say that they will. So there's the camp that says Andrew Yang will explode after his participation in the first debate. Let's see. That would be interesting. I've been interviewing Andrew Yang for a year at this point, and it was one of the earliest people talking about his campaign. There is the camp that says Tulsi Gabbard will surge after this debate. We will soon see. There are Jay Inslee supporters who say he's not well known, but he actually has the best ideas, particularly on the climate, and the country will realize this as soon as they see him in the first debate. We will soon see. As far as the front runners are concerned, there is a big contingent that says as soon as Joe Biden debates, Democratic primary voters are going to realize Joe's not progressive and he's going to drop in the polls. We will soon see whether that is the path forward for Joe Biden. And there's also lots of interest just in general in seeing how the progressive wing of the Democratic primary electorate reacts to both Warren and Bernie finally debating. Now, the only issue with that is they're debating on separate nights. Elizabeth Warren tonight on night A, Bernie Sanders tomorrow night in night B. So in order to compare Warren and Bernie, it's going to have to happen across sort of two debates effectively, because they will not be on the same debate stage. That being said, there is this question about will Bernie and Warren continue to split the majority of the progressive primary vote, or after this first debate, maybe it's going to take longer, will the more progressive contingent of the Democratic primary electorate coalesce behind either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren? I don't know the answer to that, but we will be live streaming the debate tonight and tomorrow night. I will start probably 15 or 30 minutes before the debate, so around 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific time. We'll watch it together on our YouTube channel, and then potentially I will open up the phone lines afterwards. So very, very busy. I'm actually filming a couple of appearances on other shows and doing the broadcast show and doing 3-hour live streams today and tomorrow. So I hope you will join me because we're putting in the time, that's for sure. YouTube.com/The David Pakman Show, 8:30 p.m. Eastern, maybe 8:45 p.m. Eastern tonight. And I look forward to hearing from you on Twitter as well about what you predict will happen in these debates. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. And you can also follow the show on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let me say thanks to some really great people who signed up and are now supporting the show via memberships. This really means a lot. I mean, if you listened yesterday to the story about what's going on with YouTube, this is not academic. This is actually our primary funding source. And that's why I'm thrilled to say that Kyle Fenton and Lance Schmeltz are today's two new David Pakman Show members of the day. Kyle and Lance, not necessarily having to pay a lot of money in order to make a big impact for progressive independent media shows like ours. Also want to say thanks to Ronald Schmidt, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Ronald has been with us almost 5 years, since 2014. And you can add your name to the list, and I hope you will, by going to www.joinpakman.com. We're talking about pennies a day, truly, and it makes a big difference for our program. Okay, it's time for Hatriot Mail. Hatriot Mail, of course, the much-loved and much-despised segment in which a professional voiceover artist does interpretive readings of the Hatriot Mail that I get. This week's is a special one, but first, just a reminder about what Hatriot Mail is.
Because we cling to our guns and our God, but somehow totally cool with a billionaire who wants to assault our wife. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Okay, so this week's Hatriot Mail, there's just a really great word in it. I'm not even going to say anything else, but let's take a listen. Let's take a look.
David Pakman spends 50 minutes dancing around semantics like every other NPC. David Pakman is the epitome of NPC journalism. Why is Parkman audience weaponized autistic? You are Jewish and this administration is anti-Semitic? What's? Yet another rant from our resident communist pig, Mr. Pakman.
Yeah, epitome. This is so funny. Epitome, of course, is a mispronunciation of the word epitome. And if you don't know the word and you see it spelled correctly, you might think it's pronounced epitome. And I remember every time I hear that word pronounced epitome, I think back to when I was like, I don't know how old. I was watching MSNBC and this reporter, Thomas Roberts, who I'm sure is a great guy, was just reading off of his teleprompter. And he referred to something as the epitome of something else. And I immediately realized, I'm sure that it was spelled correctly on his prompter, but he clearly doesn't know what that is. Much like Bill O'Reilly not recognizing what it means for Sting to play us out this evening in that infamous Let's Do It Live debacle. Thomas Roberts not recognizing the word epitome. But I think that we don't really need to say too much else other than NPC. Come on, that's so 3 months ago. It's like the cuck of 6 months ago. No one's using the term NPC anymore. Was anyone even really using it seriously to begin with? Let me remind you, the number one way to fight patriotism in your own community is to use the coupon code Hatriot40 when you sign up for a membership on our website. Now, this is so funny. We started the coupon code Hatriot40 years ago as sort of like a throwaway. I said, I'll just create a Hatriot Mail related coupon code for membership. I'll mention it only during Hatriot Mail segments. And let's see if anybody uses it to sign up. Probably very few people will. Every week, 5 to 7 new members sign up using the Hatriot 40 coupon code. And it was something that no one really thought would be that successful. So the way it works is the membership of your choice at www.joinpakman.com. You apply the coupon code Hatriot40, that's Hatriot 40, and the price drops 40%. You get 100% of the member benefits, including the bonus show and everything else, but you get a 40% discount. It's a beautiful thing, and I look forward to welcoming new members signing up with that code. Okay, I'm just now caught up on the different Sunday show interviews that happened this past Sunday. One was an interview with Bernie Sanders on CBS's Face the Nation. Bernie Sanders is running for president in 2020. He's currently a senator. And there was a moment where the interviewer, Margaret Brennan, truly embarrassed herself in trying to sort of play the tough devil's advocate or giving Bernie Sanders a gotcha question. And it completely imploded in utter total embarrassment when the topic of Iran came up. Now, before I play that part, I'm just going to play the first 20 seconds of this interview, which will immediately give you a sense of just how dumb and cringy this interview was. Listen to the strange sort of, I don't even know what to call it, just the entire demeanor of interviewer Margaret Brennan is bizarre towards Bernie. Here's a setup of how this interview started.
Thank you very much for making time.
My pleasure.
You've been called an existential threat to the Democratic Party. How much resistance within the party do you face?
Well, first of all, I got to figure out what this existential threat actually means. But what it came from is Third Way, which is the corporate wing of the Democratic Party.
So Bernie does a good job of slowing it all down at every opportunity during the interview, reducing the hysteria. But then they get to the topic of Iran, and Bernie starts correctly criticizing Donald Trump's completely erratic action on Iran over the weekend, which we covered, where we were bombing Iran, and then we called off the bombing of Iran. And Margaret Brennan starts playing, I don't know if it's, again, just playing a weird devil's advocate or playing a semantic game when Bernie starts talking about war with Iran, where she says, well, war, I mean, you know, it was a limited strike. And Bernie Sanders takes none of it. And he accurately and precisely and concisely and pithily destroys that argument.
I want to ask you about Iran.
Good.
Was President Trump's decision this week to call off that strike the right one?
See, it's like somebody setting a fire to a basket full of paper and then putting it out. He helped create the crisis, and then he stopped the attacks. The idea that we're looking at a president of the United States who, number one, thinks that a war with Iran is something that might be good for this country.
He was just doing a limited strike.
Oh, just a limited strike. Oh, well, I'm sorry. I just didn't know that it's okay to simply attack another country with bombs, just a limited strike. That's an act of warfare.
This is a great example of the different standards that are applied to the actions of the United States versus the actions of other countries by Americans, okay? And this is one of the things where it's so refreshing. You know, I have family in Argentina. I was born there. I have family in France and different places. And when I talk to them, it's refreshing to talk to people who are not applying a different standard to the United States than to other countries. Because think about it. If any other country launched a so-called limited strike of any kind against the United States on an American military base abroad even, everyone would be on the same page in the U.S. It's an act of warfare. Pearl Harbor, in a sense, it was a limited strike on a U.S. military base. The double standard has to stop. And I guess I sort of get the idea that Margaret Brennan is trying to play devil's advocate here and be the tough interviewer who's going to hold Bernie Sanders to account. But she's choosing all the wrong spots. It's very ignorant the way she's trying to do it. If North Korea did a limited strike in South Korea, would that be a limited strike or would it be an act of warfare? I think we all know the answer. In some sense, 9/11 was a limited strike on a very specific section of New York City and Washington, D.C. There was total consensus that it was an act of war, which was then used to justify not one but two wars, the war in Iraq, which was completely unrelated to 9/11, and an escalation of the war in Afghanistan. So I'm fine debating any of these foreign policy decisions on the merits, whether it's Iran, Syria, Venezuela, China, Cuba policy, Russia. I mean, there are serious conversations to be had about any of those countries. And I'm not just saying militarily, but in many different ways, there are legitimate debates about what U.S. foreign policy should be and how it has worked or not worked in the past. But there is this very dangerous and disturbing tendency for Americans in a sort of bubble to shrug off the actions of the American military when, if we reverse the situation, these would be obvious acts of war, which the same people would say, oh, wow, that was an act of war. The U.S. must now retaliate against this act of war. So I don't believe that it's a useful type of devil's advocacy by the interviewer, Margaret Brennan. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. I understand playing devil's advocate. I do it on this show, but I try to do it in a thoughtful way where it makes sense. I don't just pick random semantic devil's advocacy and throw it out there to make it seem like I'm challenging the guest. I want to be challenging the guest in a way that is substantive and critically useful. It's merely sort of manufacturing a context in which we can then shrug off our own aggressive acts of violence, what Margaret Brennan is doing here. It should be denounced, and this is not the type of cover we want to provide to our foreign policy apparatus, particularly not when you have a completely clueless and ignorant president in Donald Trump surrounded by people who are almost completely off the rails, unhinged when it comes to foreign policy. People like John Bolton and Stephen Miller and others that are surrounding Donald Trump. It's straight up irresponsible to do this bogus gotcha faux devil's advocacy that was done here. Good for Bernie, though, in absolutely destroying it. Make sure you follow me on Instagram at david.pacman. I've got some great behind the scenes stuff from the studio, people curious about what things look like here, and lots of other great stuff. Follow me there at david.pacman and follow the show on Instagram at David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. Welcome back to the David Pacman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Nancy Isenberg, who's the author of the New York Times bestseller White Trash. Her new book, co-authored with Andrew Burstein, is The Problem of Democracy, and it will be reviewed in the New York Times Sunday Book Review this coming weekend. Nancy, great to talk to you.
Well, nice to meet you, or at least hear you.
Let's start with the sort of history of democracy in the United States, because I think that there is this view held among many, if not all, that the sort of the type of democracy with the parameters that it has in 2019 is the obvious result of the range of views that were held by the founders and framers of the United States. But this is not true, right? I mean, there was a range of opinion as to what type of representative democracy we should have.
You're exactly right. I mean, what we forget is that the government that we have, if we think about the federal government, was set up as a constitutional republic. There's no mention of democracy in our federal constitution. There's no mention of democracy in our favorite text, the Declaration of Independence. And at the time of the founding, if we think about from the period of the Revolution to the Constitutional Convention, basically democracy was seen as something that was best served by Congress. Congress was to be the democratic branch. And when we talk about a range of opinions, there were still people who were deeply concerned about democracy. Democracy was associated with the period of the classics. And as John Adams said, later he basically would refer to how there was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. They were aware that democracies, pure democracies, which we don't even have a pure democracy today, were historically seen as unstable governments.
I think it's important before we go any further, because I know that there will be people in my audience who will immediately think of this. There are ways in which pointing out that we have a constitutional republic is sometimes used in 2019 or 2018 to justify voter suppression, when there are people today who are understandably concerned about some of the voter suppression tactics and the influence they have on democracy, the term used colloquially. You will see some of the supporters of those tactics say, why are you talking about democracy? We have a constitutional republic. And I would like, now that you're here, to tell us why it is really important to understand that when people say that, they don't mean that if we have an election, it's okay not to let people vote or not to count people's votes, that we are talking about a structure of government, and it is a much higher level conversation.
Yeah, I think there's several things to realize. I mean, any government, it changes over time. I mean, right now we're facing problems that have to do with partisan gerrymandering. We have problems of too much money in campaigns, the idea of the donor class, which is something that the founders never supported. And the other thing you have to realize is that I disagree with that. We have to understand the real historical roots of our government. Because there has always been voter suppression. I wrote about this in the context of white trash, that during the period of poll taxes, which were not considered unconstitutional until like 1966, essentially there have always been efforts to suppress the vote. Think about the fact that women were not allowed to vote until 1920. So we have to realize that at every stage of our historical development, there have been efforts to suppress the vote, and we haven't just had this gradual development, this evolution of our government from a constitutional republic to a more perfect democracy. Democracies have problems rooted in the rise of parties, which is something else that the founders did not include in the Constitution. They should have anticipated parties because they existed in Great Britain, but they didn't realize how much party development would lead to these kinds of abuses like voter suppression. My point of mentioning that it's a constitutional republic is to understand the actual structure and institution that we still live in today, and to understand what are the powers of the different branches of government. And for John Adams, the key was that you needed institutions to check the abuses, the inevitable abuses that all human beings are prone to. He was very aware that people are prone to abuses that come from ambition, which come from vanity. This is why his major concern of any kind of elective form of government, and this was true for even governments that we think of as completely different from ours. Even in monarchies, for example, he talked about how the people are often reduced to spectators. And they are often trained and often encouraged to worship elites. And this is even true today. This is why the media is constantly talking about the cult of personality, which we highlight in our book, because this is a problem that has to do with voters being, and it's even worse today, voters being reduced to spectators, where they simply are caught up in the excitement, the game of the election, caught up in the allure and the personality of the candidates.
Let's talk a little bit about the way in which we can maybe make some good faith critiques of some elements of modern democracy. And one of the things I've always found interesting has been Plato's view on democracy. And when you look at Plato's pseudo-skepticism, maybe we could call it, or even opposition in some sense to democracy, part of his opposition, if I recall correctly, is based on some of the particular characteristics of Athenian democracy, like the ease with which people are just executed, for example, and it's not so relevant today. But one of the ways that he was concerned about democracy was the way in which democracy arguably stands sort of in opposition to expertise and the idea of getting the most informed people making decisions, which, of course, as we understand it today, we have a crisis of so-called expertise and the expert industrial complex, and it brings up a whole other slate of issues if we were to go in that direction. So to step back from this and take kind of like a 40,000-foot view, what are the most important and relevant critiques of democracy that you would make in modern day?
Yeah, I think, first of all, one of the things that John Adams insisted on, he believed that people should not be in power forever. He believed it was very important, even at the level of who we elect to Congress, that they needed to be returned to the people. They needed to be humbled. They needed to stay in touch with the people. He also believed strongly in the importance of the town meeting. And this is actually comparable to what Jefferson said when he described ward democracy. They both believed that there needed to be a local foundation for democracy, that the people actually knew how to effectively articulate their demands. And John Adams, because in Massachusetts they believed in education, which they didn't in Virginia because they didn't want to pay for it.
Yes.
He believed that from infancy, this is what he wrote, from infancy, that essentially people needed to learn how to deliberate, debate, and articulate their views. And this came from the local institution of the town meeting. His son, John Quincy Adams, would carry on that view when he becomes the ardent defender of the petition. And petitions were the most widespread way for everyone in society to articulate their grievances. And in fact, he defended the right of petition not only for white men, but for slaves, for women, and even for the vilified anti-slavery activists. So this is one of the essential ingredients of John and John Quincy Adams that gets forgotten. And it's because they're New Englanders, I think, that they still kind of fall into that camp of believing in local politics, and that's essential to democracy. The other issue that I think is relevant today is the one that I was getting to, is as we know, we have seen our executive branch become more powerful. This really begins in Eisenhower's era. This is where the right of executive privilege was first invented. We also see the increasing power of the executive in foreign policy. And one of the things, this is what they were deeply concerned with, because with John Quincy Adams, what he saw emerging around Andrew Jackson was very much this cult, what we refer to as the warrior cult of popularity, and the fact that he saw people being obsequious. This is his words, obsequious to executive power. And this is one of the dangers. I mean, in a sense, it's one of those basic principles we always go back to. But John and John Quincy Adams believed that you needed each branch of government to be able to check the power of other branches of government, because they're all prone to abuses.
And so what, I
yeah.
mean, along those lines, what changes, what are the specific changes that could be made in order to address these issues that have developed?
Yeah, well, I think one of the key issues I've already mentioned is the problem of regulating the amount of money that controls politics today. We also need to think about the problem that we all know about, and many people are writing about right now, is the damage done through the internet. The way, and this is why I talked about why we have this kind of virtual cult of personality. The fact that so much of people's information today comes through the internet. The fact that there's not only do we have the abuse of elections that can come through the internet, but people, in a sense, are fed things that, as we know, are untrue, are lies. This is what John Adams referred to as quackery. And I think this is the problem. And this gets back to your point that, yes, we need an educated citizenry, but not just educated in a sense that it's only the college elites or the professional elites have to control government. It gets back to this idea of making sure that people through the town meeting can make their representatives accountable. You remember when several politicians actually had town meetings who had never had them before, and they suddenly had to answer questions that the media weren't asking them.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the issues we have to find a way to address.
Briefly, what is the degree to which the sort of celebrity worship type culture that we have today, and that in great part is at least partially responsible for Donald Trump becoming president of the United States, how much of an issue was that in the time of the Adamses and earlier times in the United States sort of political infrastructure?
Yeah, I know we can sort of clearly identify Donald Trump's rise through his role in reality TV, but it's not new. Essentially, this is one of the things we highlight. I mean, the first time that John Adams sees the cult of personality take shape is when he is in France and watching Benjamin Franklin turned into the first American rock star. He was adored by the French people, and he played the role. He was always on a stage. And he used that as part of his, diplomatic gamesmanship. Then we have George Washington, and this is where the danger is with the executive branch, because part of where the invented powers of the executive branch come from, borrowing from monarchy, borrowing from the traditions of royalty. This is where executive privilege actually comes from. And in addition to that, one of the things John Adams said about Washington is the idea that, Washington was successful because of invented stories of his heroics. People praised his horsemanship. They essentially admired him, and as he said, for his handsome face, for his polite bearing, and also for his large estate, that they knew he was a wealthy, and they admired him for this.
So nothing new there, in a sense.
No, nothing new. And then when we get to John Quincy Adams' critique of Andrew Jackson, is that Jackson's identity, he's the first to have a campaign biography that doesn't highlight his statesmanship, because that's not where he had really any experience whatsoever at all. But they turned him into the hero. They turned him into this figure. And even though people knew about Jackson, they knew he was imperious, they knew that he wasn't that well educated. They, in a sense, tried to invent this very popular image for Andrew Jackson that was used to sort of, again, celebrate his personality. Jackson as a person, not as someone who deserved to be in such a high important office of the presidency. And that's where the danger lies. We still live in a society where people vote based on whether they like the candidate. They vote on whether they think the candidate likes them. And they assume, which is usually incorrect because TV doesn't tell you the truth, they assume they know a candidate because they've listened to them talk, and they somehow assume that they're up close and personal, which is what TV gives you the false sense of. But in fact, they're responding to all the wrong cues. And the media contributes to this because the media is obsessed with, getting the sound bites, showing the candidates face and responses, and never really focusing on what's most important, which is not only the issues, but right now we need to focus on how we have to give a civics lesson to Americans about how the government really functions. What are the real duties of Congress? What is the role of the Supreme Court? What are the limitations on the executive branch? We really need to kind of remind people and keep people up to date on what the real roles of government are as a way to make sure that they don't sort of imagine just because a candidate says something that it's true.
No question about that. We've been speaking with Nancy Isenberg. She is co-author of the new book, The Problem of Democracy, with Andrew Burstein. The book will be reviewed in the New York Times Sunday Book Review this coming weekend. Nancy, really a pleasure having you on.
Well, thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, so yesterday I did a story about how YouTube is increasingly destroying independent news and politics channels. And I explained to you that YouTube is increasingly prioritizing basically just what makes them money by keeping advertisers happy. And since September, that has not been independent content like ours. It's been instead this legacy corporate content. And I went through yesterday in much more detail than I will do today how our portion of videos that come from what is called the suggested video feed on YouTube, it's an algorithm that says, oh, you watched this piece of video, here's other stuff you might like. We used to get a third of our views from that suggested video algorithm. That has fallen basically by 50% to under 17% so far in June. This, maybe it seems like a lot, maybe it doesn't, but as I said yesterday, this is about half of what we were once getting from this algorithm. And this decline started right after YouTube announced that in an effort to crack down on fake news, which may well be a good faith effort, they are going to back what they consider authoritative sources. And that has coincidence, right, with the decline from 33% of our views coming from the suggested view sources to under 17%. And this is a massive blow to our revenue because it represents a lot of views. I mentioned yesterday, and I'm just getting you up to speed before I give you the new info about how this is much worse than even I thought. In December, we got 3.5 million views just from the suggested video feed. In June, we will be lucky to get 1.5 million views. That's a 2 million view shortfall, which is a huge revenue shortfall, very, very big. I can't tell you how much revenue that is, but if you Google YouTube CPMs, you could probably calculate it for yourselves. And I received a flood of emails yesterday telling me just how bad it is, and it's actually even worse than I thought. I want to remind you, Alexander wrote to me last week or the week before, and he told me something that's really odd, which was that he had never watched anything by Joe Rogan on YouTube before. And then I was on Joe Rogan's program on June 5th, and Alexander watched one video on Joe Rogan's channel, my interview with Joe, and the next day, every single recommended video was a Joe Rogan video, despite Alexander having watched my content on YouTube for years and having been previously recommended my content on YouTube. I now have even more data points, and it's really bad. A lot of people wrote to me with basically some version of this email that Lisa wrote to me. Lisa wrote to me yesterday and said, hey, David, just listen to the podcast where you spoke about the new algorithm for YouTube. I noticed last week that you were no longer on my homepage of YouTube, and I had to search for you. I have a subscription, so you did turn up on the subscription page. I've also noticed that The Majority Report, Kyle Kulinski, and other shows I watch are no longer on my homepage, despite me having subscriptions for a long time. My homepage is now filled with many things I don't watch or subscribe to, mainly balanced between parakeets, I don't even know what that is, and Cardi B. I'm so sorry that this is affecting your show financially. I love your show. Keep up the good work. Sadly, dozens of emails like this. And as I've said before, we know what the solution is here. We've got to disconnect the programming from being dependent on ad revenue. That's the solution. I've said before, I estimate under 1% of my audience funds the show directly through membership. If we can get from under 1% to 2%, we're in fantastic shape. If we can get to 3% of our audience supporting us directly, we have no more problems, period. I mean, we're talking about such small percentages that going from 0.8% to 2% or 0.8% to 3% is a game changer. So I believe this has to be a wake-up call. It doesn't have to be this show, okay? What I'm telling you is if there are programs that you like, that you want to see remain independent, that you want to see producing the content they believe should be produced, not what is going to be monetized by YouTube or other arbitrary algorithms, we need to support those shows directly if we can afford to do so. With my program, the way to do that is at joinpacman.com, okay? We have normal prices that I believe are very reasonable with a pay what you can afford model starting at $6 a month or $60 per year. However, I understand that's a lot of money for many people in the audience, and that's okay. We have discounts available. I mean, it's just take the discount if you want it. If you apply the coupon code, this is 2020 when you sign up, any membership is reduced by 40%, okay? I'm going to say something even further today. There is an old coupon code, which we very briefly promoted, which we haven't been promoting, but because the situation is just so important right now, I'm going to give it out today. If you want a 50% discount, okay, which will get you down to $3 a month or $30 a year. $30 a year is like $280 a month, okay? The coupon code HALF19, HALF19, will drop any membership by 50%. We're not talking about a lot of money, but this is the way that we fix this problem. It's the way, it's the most direct way, and that's why I'm asking for your support. Please share this video using the share button on YouTube, because it's really important to get news of what's going on to as many people as possible. And yes, I know people are saying, hey, David, did you hear about X YouTuber who's seeing the same thing? Who's on the right, maybe? Did you hear about X YouTuber on the Y YouTuber on the left who's seeing the same thing? Yes, I'm in touch with a lot of those folks, and we are talking about this a lot. There's no question about it. Okay, so Roy Moore, the serial accused child sex assaulter who narrowly lost the Alabama Senate election in 2017 to Doug Jones after numerous sexual assault allegations against him, is running again in 2020. And quite frankly, why wouldn't he? I mean, he almost won, right? I've told you that despite being almost identical on many issues, Republicans and Democrats handle sexual assault allegations against candidates in their party very, very differently. Roy Moore got 48.3% of the vote in the election that he ultimately lost in Alabama. He almost won. So why wouldn't he run again? You'll remember, compare and contrast, that Al Franken, Democratic senator, for something much more minor, was forced to resign by both Republicans, but ultimately because even Democrats said, yeah, Al Franken should probably go, while Roy Moore was almost given a Senate seat despite multiple allegations against him, including some involving teenage girls. And the funniest thing about this, if there's anything funny, and this is basically just serious, but there's one funny element about this, there are prominent Republicans pretending that Roy Moore is an outlier in a sense, that he's not representative of the Republican Party, but they're actually wrong. Unfortunately for the Republican Party and for America, this is exactly representative of the Republican Party. Nikki Haley is Donald Trump's former ambassador to the United Nations. She's the former governor of South Carolina. And she came forward to say on Twitter, quote, "Who in the world are his advisors? At what point does he think another run will have a different response? He does not represent our Republican Party." What the hell is she talking about? This guy is completely representative of the Republican Party. And you know that because almost every Republican in Alabama voted for him, despite multiple sexual assault allegations against him. And he barely lost. He got 48.3% of the vote. If Republicans had a problem with Roy Moore, if they felt that a candidate riddled with sexual assault allegations against him, including those involving teenage girls, they wouldn't have almost elected him U.S. Senator from Alabama. Trump was elected despite allegations that he sexually assaulted countless women, including an underage girl. Alabama Republicans nominated Roy Moore. They selected him from a choice of Republican options, and then almost all of them voted for him to a degree that almost got him the Senate seat, 48.3% of the total vote. So let's be clear. Yes, there are lots of Republicans like Nikki Haley who see Roy Moore's another candidacy, I don't know what number it makes, as a strategic mistake. They say, well, if someone else ran against Democrat Doug Jones in the very red state of Alabama, we would likely win this seat back from Democrats. But with Roy Moore, Doug Jones might get himself reelected. That's true, but that's simply the Republican Party seeing this as sport, which they do, and seeing this as wins and losses. We'll see what happens in the Republican primary in Alabama. There's still lots of time for other Republicans to get in and challenge Roy Moore. Very long list of possible candidates already surfacing. Either way, regardless of this seat, I don't see the math for Democrats to take control of the Senate in 2020 just because of which seats are up for re-election. But Doug Jones holding on to this seat would be terrific because it's one seat we don't have to win back in 2022 in order to take control of the Senate then. Again, I don't see any path for Democrats to take control in 2020, but still holding the Doug Jones seat rather than losing it back to a Republican, which is arguably predictable in Alabama, is one seat we don't have to make up for in 2022, potentially to take control back of the Senate. So let's do what we can when the time comes to help Doug Jones get reelected in Alabama. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. And today's voicemail is once again this nonsense type of thing about David, will you trash Sam Seder? Will you trash some other host? But it's actually kind of a funny one, and it might even be tongue-in-cheek. So let's take a listen to it.
Hey, David, this is Justin here. I just want to know, do you think that Sam Seder is like in the pocket of big business? I mean, if you look at his career and his resume, he's in the pocket of big, Sex and the City, big Bob's Burgers, big Mark Maron. Like, so you're saying, do you think he's a independent actor like yourself, or do you think he's a, big corporatist in the pocket of these big corporate media corporations? Just want to know your answer on this. All right. Have a nice day.
Okay, yeah. So listen, if that's tongue-in-cheek, if that's satire, going back to this entire thing of, tattle on Sam Seder, tattle on David Pakman to Sam Seder, get this host to attack that host. If it's satire, it's very, very clever. If it's serious, seek help is my only answer. On today's bonus show, we will talk about Congressman Duncan Hunter using campaign funds for his personal sexual affairs, according to prosecutors. We will talk about San Francisco banning the sales of e-cigarettes. And we will also talk about some billionaires who have made what to some people is a surprising request to the 2020 Democratic candidates. The billionaires that are saying, tax me more, put more taxes on me as a billionaire, because we believe it would be good for the economy. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to get access to the bonus show. They both are instant access and take under a minute. Okay. Number 1, become a member at www.joinpakman.com. Number 2, become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Look forward to talking to you on the bonus show today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.